Welcome to Cross-Border Tax Talks, where we discuss the latest trends in international taxation, from the OECD's latest developments to the taxation of the Metaverse. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's Global International Tax Services Leader. You can find these podcasts on YouTube at youtube.com/Doug McHoney. On this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks, we're in our Policy on Demand studio in Washington, D.C., where I'm excited to be joined by Rebecca Lee, an international tax partner in our Washington National Tax Services practice. Rebecca, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Doug.
So Rebecca, I think this is officially your 6th visit to the podcast. I think I have that right?
I think that's right.
I was too lazy to go back through the 104 episodes, but I think you're at number 6. So congratulations to you as the second member of the Cross-Border Tax Talks 5-Timers Club. But unlike the other 5-timer, who's Pat Brown, when you come on, I feel like I have to do extra homework, given the niche of your practice, which for avid listeners will remember foreign exchange, crypto, and now the Metaverse. And all of these are kind of inextricably linked. But so my first question for you before we get into the substance of the material, how did you get into these areas of tax? Or said another way, channeling my 18-year-old nephew, why are you so weird?
I know, right?
Right.
You know, I got into the Metaverse, which was a natural step from crypto, because I have a background in macroeconomic policy and the idea of the focus on monetary policy, what has value, how do we control its value, naturally kind of springboards you to crypto. But more fundamentally, I got really good advice when I was a first-year tax intern with my first tax job ever, which was if you find the areas that no one else is working in and you find a way to make yourself useful, you will always have work to do. And that's how I did everything in my career, from foreign currency to working on the split dollar regulations when I was in government, like all these weird things, because no one else wanted to work on them, and I would volunteer.
I remember working very, very early in my career with you on some of those areas.
That's anything right. that no one else wanted to do and they didn't understand. I'd be like, yeah, I'd be glad to help. Let me do that.
Got it. And for the record, I like weird. I can relate. And so I assumed, Rebecca, that there was a tie-in, or at least somebody thought, well, Rebecca does currency, foreign currency matters. Cryptocurrency has currency in the word. And I was wondering if that was why there was a connection, even though they're very, very different issues.
That makes it sound so intentional from like somebody looking at it and saying it'd be great for, I mean, the way that this came up organically is sitting in San Francisco, where I lived for over a decade. Questions would come in from local clients where it'd be like, oh, we're thinking about, like when Bitcoin first was launched, we're thinking about giving away Bitcoin to our employees because it was 1-to-1 to the dollar. That would have been cool if people had held on to it. Or there were organizations looking at where should we invest in these new startups, because there's all these startups in the Bay Area, think 2011, 2012, 2013, that were all using this new technology of the blockchain to try to do stuff. And now the stuff's really evolved, but at the time, because I am the person who does all the weird stuff, and I was the only one in San Francisco doing anything remotely like that, I would get on every single one of those calls, and they'd be kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. And so that did culminate, for example, with me meeting 2 dudes in their garage. I thought that was an office. Right. It was not. So I stood in the driveway and shouted questions at them that were tax related. Because I was like, I don't know you, I'm not coming over there. But the idea—
You're too young for one of those individuals to be Steve Jobs, I assume.
Sadly, but that's exactly, that is so permeated the culture of the Bay Area that you don't know when the next guy who's in a garage is the next Steve Jobs or Steve Wozniak, and there's an opportunity there. Right. And so those questions, 1 became 2, 2 became 4, and as larger organizations were spending time in this area, I had built up this knowledge base and credibility.
Great. So what I'd like to do for this podcast, Rebecca, is really kind of dispel some of the myths associated with the Metaverse, because it's so heavy in vernacular and kind of such an obtuse issue. So I want to actually spend some time really kind of unpacking some of like what is the Metaverse, and then we'll talk about some of the tax implications, because it's still obviously very early days on how this is being taxed. But I thought I'd start with sharing my first experience with a virtual environment, with the Metaverse, so to speak. And it was during the lockdown. We were looking for a meeting environment outside the traditional webcam-enabled services that would allow us to work in a big group environment, but also work within table groups. So what we were trying to do is we had some technology, we were trying to do trainings, and historically we'd bring everybody into a big conference room, we'd have table groups, we'd have somebody kind of up on stage that would share the technology, and then we could then step aside and work within table groups, and then we could have people, kind of our experts, walk around and then help with the table groups. And so when we started trying to do this with the traditional kind of virtual webcam meetings, that's very hard. As I'm sure many of our listeners know, trying to do these breakout sessions, and it's very clunky because you have to kind of come out and come back in, and it's just not really seamless. And so we were able to identify a service provider that we built a campus, is what they refer to it, with a little island that was for our particular team. And it was unbelievable how well it worked. So I created my own little avatar, right? It had proximity for sound. And so as you walked around this kind of virtual environment, first of all, it did not require headsets. And so I think that is kind of one of the misnomers, is that or you know, the beliefs that you have to have a headset to be able to do the metaverse, and you don't. You could just have a regular screen, and it's kind of like a first-person shooter game for those that are into the gaming experience. But I was able to walk into this conference room. I mean, it was super cool because we had been in lockdown. We hadn't actually seen, you know, other than virtual calls, our colleagues, and you could walk around and talk to people. And as you get closer, like, you can hear them. When we actually sat down in the table groups, there's the technology allowed just you to hear what's within your table group and then what's being said by the primary speaker. I mean, it was just a very cool virtual experience. And I can see conferences, you know, both whether it's internal within an organization to train people or even external, that this could be the future. But I just wanted to encourage business leaders who listen to the Cross-Border Tax Talks to consider this for meetings, because it really kind of changed my view. And I'm not a big gamer. I was a big Nintendo kid, but I'm dating myself and haven't played a lot of the first-person games. But this really kind of transformed my thinking of, like, there are practical implications of the metaverse for business. And that's why I wanted to have this discussion, obviously thinking about the tax implications. Okay, so that is just kind of one practical use for the metaverse, but wanted to share that. And as I mentioned, one of the more challenging aspects of this area, particularly people who just don't spend a lot of time, is that it is just, as I mentioned, thick with jargon and vernacular. So I'm going to start with some definitions, Rebecca, and just want to get your reaction for people who don't spend a lot of time in this space. What are these things? And hopefully make it a lot less confusing, particularly for the tax folks that listen to this, that are talking to their business people. So the first one, Web 3.0.
Or Web 3, or both.
All right, okay.
So and they mean slightly different things, but in general, it's a term that's intended to capture the future of the internet. So if you stick with the Web 3.0 kind of vernacular, Web 1.0 was basically read and consume. That the internet was not really interactive. I could go to a website, I could view content there, think a blog. Mm-hmm. So Web 2.0 is the idea of the creator economy, the idea that now the internet is interactive, that anyone can have a social media presence, I can put out my creation, I have all these outlets for people to connect directly, and it isn't just a mechanism to deliver information, it's an ability to connect. And the idea is that Web 3.0 is you can sort of view, you can create, and you can own your data. So the idea, or own your creation, the concept of not just being able to put out sort of content on social media, that it's interoperable, it is ever changing, and that you as an individual creator or participant in the ecosystem can actually not just do things that change someone else's environment, as opposed to like just posting your own content and engaging with your fan base, but also the idea that those are things that you could find ways to own, instead of me posting content and it's hosted on someone else's platform or someone else's marketplace, that I have the ability to sort of craft the entire universe in which my product is consumed, and that I can own the underlying, sort of a bigger piece of the underlying IP.
Got it. We're going to come back into individual transactions and unpack that a bit, but I think that's a good starting point. All right, next term, blockchain.
Okay. So blockchain, or decentralized ledger technology, DLT, is the idea that instead of having a centralized ledger for information to be stored, and you can think of that, I always love the car example, and that's like the DMV, or with real property, the land title being maintained by a central register. Instead, blockchain decentralizes the ability to maintain, if you will, the ledger of transactions. And the trade-off is that instead of having, let's say, one server or one centralized source of truth, you have multiple nodes that are all maintaining pieces of the information that when they come together, they create, if you will, the source of truth. And the words in there matter. The reason why it's called blockchain is the idea that every time a transaction is approved, every time an asset changes hands, every time a thing is done, it adds another block to a seamless, immutable chain of transactions that cannot go back and be changed or altered. And you can view the entirety of the experience. Sort of blockchain technology at its core, although you can always change this, is that it is publicly available. You can go back and view the history of the chain and see every transaction ever.
I love the analogy to like the DMV or for registering real estate, because we all have those experiences. You buy a new car, you've got to go get that thing registered. But to your point, like that, there's one source of truth, or there's one location where you can go to get that. And we know that's the DMV, depending on what state you're in, right? Or whatever county you're in for real estate. But this really allows this to be scaled, if you will, and not have that one centralized location, but it still offers kind of proof, if you will, of ownership. And I'm probably not using the right terms, but at least that's the way I think about it, is it establishes, well, this is what this person owns.
And if you think about it, like really belaboring the car analogy, when you go to the car dealership and you drive away, you gave them your money and you drove away with a car, and it feels like you own that car. But until that piece of paper gets processed by your centralized processing station, technically you don't own that car, the dealership does. And that's a really odd feeling. And what if you could just have that transaction where you went in, you paid for the car, they transferred you the car, and that was it, and you drove away, and then you own the car. That's what blockchain fundamentally is trying to do. I love
it. It's supposed to, I got to wait a week to get my title.
I don't have my plates yet. And what
I don't have my plates.
You know?
Got it. Okay. Next piece then, and this is really obviously related to blockchain, is cryptocurrency.
Okay. Cryptocurrency is a type of digital asset, so an asset created via blockchain or distributed ledger technology that is intended to be used as a store of value and a medium for payment. So in the same way that fiat currency, money that is issued by a central banking government, can be used to pay for transactions, do other things, the idea of a cryptocurrency is that it's a digital asset that itself maintains value and can be used as a medium to pay for other things, goods, services, other kinds of assets.
And in that respect, it's fungible, right? Because it can move and can be used as consideration for things.
It's inherently fungible.
Right. And so, all right. So you also mentioned the term fiat currency, which, just to remind listeners, that's just good old cash, right? Or not necessarily in the physical form, but dollars, euros, those are examples of fiat currency.
That's exactly right. And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, but the idea of, you said it's physical money, but not in a physical form. We get stuck on that all the time when we talk about assets that are digital assets, because my money that's sitting in my bank account, which I don't go and withdraw it and then like roll around in it or anything.
You don't get to see a pile of it.
No, I don't go visit it and say, oh, good, you're here.
There it is.
But I view that money as being just as mine as the dollar bill sitting in my wallet. And I think that that's a really good maybe analogy to think about when we think about other experiences in the metaverse.
That's a great point, because it's hard to get your head around this kind of stuff. Okay, so this has been, there's a lot of news about this non-fungible token. So we talked about cryptocurrency, which is fungible. What are non-fungible tokens, or NFTs?
Non-fungible tokens, same baseline technology, blockchain or distributed ledger technology. Because I mentioned that each of those blocks is created separately, you can have a token, or if you will, a digital asset that's created where the technology itself validates that that's the only one of it. It has its own equivalent of a serial number, and it is not fungible with any other equivalent token. So, serial number 1 is not the same and isn't intended to be interchangeable with serial number 2. So that technology, which is just a slightly different way of programming in the same kind of base layers of blockchain technology, it allows you to do things that can look like securities offerings, because I can have things that I can buy things that are all different and not necessarily the same. I can use that to package digital art, digital music, digital video experiences. And I can use it also to capture all kinds of other rights and obligations, because the core of the underlying technology for any non-fungible token is something called a smart contract. It's a programmable contract that decides all the circumstances, the if-then, to enable the transaction to occur, to buy either your digital image. And coming back to cars and real estate, the idea of taking that same technology and applying it to, I can have a token that represents my car in real life or my house, and being able to have a transaction, for example, where house title transfers via NFT, because there's an N=1 experience. My house is my only house.
That's it.
And you can transfer that using blockchain. And there have been title companies that have actually been experimenting with the ability to transfer using non-fungible token technology to transfer real estate title. Or I could have I leave the dealership driving away in my real life car with my NFT transferred to my digital wallet that represents title ownership of my car. And so if you take all of those examples that I use together and you say, well, that's great, I now have no idea what an NFT is. That's because it can be virtually anything. It is programmable, but the one thing it is unique from every other token.
Right. And one of the examples that I like, as a kid, I used to collect a lot of baseball cards, right? And Ozzie Smith, former Cardinal, Hall of Famer.
Darryl Strawberry, my first baseball card.
All right. I had a Darryl Strawberry rookie card,
I had
fact.
one too.
And so, I think of that and that had value, right? Like it first of all had value to us as collectors, but you could go and look up in the books, that was before the internet, and say, well, this is how much a mint condition Darryl Strawberry card. And we knew that there were a limited number of those cards, right, based on the various card manufacturers, and there were some were valued more than others. But we knew it had the brand. We knew that was there were only so many of those, and it had value. And so as I think about like an NFT, you could create baseball cards, right, as NFTs, and it can be one unique one. It could also be a series. This could be one of 50, right? But I was talking to my wife in anticipation of this, and we were talking about NFTs, and it's like, well, what is the value of this NFT? Well, what is the value of that Darryl Strawberry or that Ozzie Smith baseball card? Like, I knew what Ozzie Smith looked like. I could cut out a picture of Ozzie Smith from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, right, and say, well, this is what Ozzie looks like, but it wasn't the picture that I valued, it was this card, right, that we knew that there was a limited number of. And so similarly with NFTs, like the market and the community respects that, well, this is how many new cards that we have, and then you can sell those and say, well, I'm one of 50 people or 500, or in the case of a house or a car, you're one of one that can own that.
Well, I've had 10 NFT valuation conversations this week, and it's Wednesday. So I think you hit on something that's actually really important, not just for the discussions more broadly of the metaverse. Scarcity is a big driver of, if you will, value, real or perceived in this space, but also the idea of what makes this different. I'm just picturing young Doug McHoney making his own baseball cards by cutting out pictures from the newspaper. I really like that.
I didn't do that, but I could have.
You could have on your own cardboard. Right. But the idea that there's something special about something that has been previously created by the creator you're paying for their content. The fact that it is authenticated. So when you buy the print of the artwork that you really like, that's sold by the artist and it's signed, the fact that you have a certificate of authenticity matters. And the NFT wrapper acts as the certificate of authenticity. Right. Now, there is something called right-clicking, which is a thing that you can take, let's say, a very famous NFT piece of digital art. You can right-click on it and copy it, right, and try to fraudulently create your own NFT. The technology around the NFT is what ensures the scarcity and the authenticity of the thing you are buying, which differentiates from when you make your own copy of it. Mm-hmm. I think the one thing that is very challenging about all of this is that it's really easy to think about in the world of baseball cards or similar, where you can think about it in the world of collectibles. I think the NFT marketplace has changed so fundamentally is that we're not just dealing with things that are collectibles anymore. We're dealing with so much of a broader asset class.
Got it. All right, so a couple more terms, and we will get to the tax issues. Interoperability.
Well, that is what it sounds like. That's right. The ability of this technology to interact with each other. And I think interoperability in the world, when we think about the metaverse, is the idea of, you used it with your experience, that people moving in space and being able to interact with each other. On the more programming-based level, the idea of having different kinds of blockchain technology that you can bridge between,
Right.
That is incredibly important.
Yeah, that's the way I think about it, kind of being able to move your kind of avatar as well as your assets, almost like it's your person through multiple different environments, which is really different than kind of the Web 2.0, right, where we have to kind of go in, each kind of whether it's social media or various ways that we consume media is all kind of historically or traditionally done through apps, right? And this is a way to potentially interconnect those.
Think of it in gaming, that when you play in a particular game, you can't just leave that game with all my cool sword and then take it over to my next game. It's not even me in the same avatar when I play in a different game. The universe has limits to it.
And I think some of that interoperability is more visionary. We'll see how much things will connect, but you can certainly see the case for why that should be. All right, so finally, and I think we've hit on a lot of the pieces, how would you define what is the metaverse?
So the metaverse is a persistent, always expanding, immersive online experience. And so you bringing together a bunch of our themes, it is interoperable. The thing that I do when I'm sitting with you in the metaverse has real life impact to both of us. The assets that are created can be moved or ported from one environment to another. Immersive doesn't just mean, you use the example of like the glasses, or it can mean involving virtual reality, augmented reality, and other technologies. But more importantly, the environment is 360 in nature. You can move in your space, and you're not just stuck to pre-existing pathways. And it is fundamentally limitless. The idea of my game doesn't end. I can continue to walk down the virtual road and explore other environments. Now, to your point, much of that is yet to be built, but there are absolutely neighborhoods and areas to explore.
Campuses,
things to be purchased and experienced. And I think that more fundamentally, what has, I think, caused a lot of organizations to look at themselves and say, what is our metaverse strategy? Is it's also a way of interacting with businesses and with other platforms that is now looking for a greater depth of experience than merely one that's baseline transactional in nature.
Right. And one thing I do want to, again, remind listeners, it does not require a VR headset. Like, I think that is a big, people think that, because you can just look on it on a screen, right, a regular screen, and still have that 3D experience. And so I think some people say, well, I don't have that headset. The metaverse is not accessible to me, and that's just simply not the case. All right, so let's get into some tax issues, and I thought, Rebecca, that we could do that in the context of transactions that we might see in the metaverse. And so the first one I wanted to start with is digital purchases, and I think that, generally speaking, that the purchases that we see in the metaverse are generally going to be using some form of cryptocurrency type technology. And so talk about what are the tax implications of there. Obviously, presumably, we've got users that are sitting in certain locations, and this is like, if the people are wondering, why are we talking about this from an international tax perspective? Well, you can imagine people sitting all over the world interacting in this common space. So let's start with digital purchases using crypto.
I just feel like this is, you want to go shopping, and you're like, what are the things I can go buy, and then what do we need to worry about? But no, it's absolutely true. So I can buy anything from real estate to my virtual card. I can
real
buy
estate in the metaverse.
Real estate in the metaverse.
Right.
So when we start trying to figure out taxing locations, I might start with, where am I sitting? Because it's my asset that I'm acquiring. I'm going to put it in a digital wallet. I might care where my digital wallet is. That's going to be hosted on a server I may not know the location of. Mm-hmm. That actual exchange itself, if you think about trying to analogize it to title passage concepts,
right,
that occurs in a geographically anonymous location, because there is no location of the metaverse. I might care where Doug is sitting, who I will not know that Doug is even Doug most of the time. I will have either an avatar, or more importantly, I may just be buying from another digital wallet address. So identity anonymous. Mm-hmm. So I now have two people who don't know where each other is sitting, me buying, you selling. I don't know where title transfers. I also then, I might look to, well, what's the law governing that transaction? Like what law governs the purchase or the sale? And I might then look at my terms of service if I'm doing it on a platform, and you may look at yours and they might be real quiet on this topic.
Or they could be different too, right? One could be one of the governed under the laws of the US, one could be governed under the laws of Australia or wherever.
And I may look at the thing I bought and I say, well, that's okay. What protects the thing I bought? And then you're looking at a patchwork of, we're all talking about things that are not physical. So we're dealing with a patchwork of intellectual property laws that may or may not protect the thing that I just acquired. And each jurisdiction may take its own views about who has the right to protect that. I got into a really interesting sourcing discussion around the question of, when that transaction occurs, am I looking to the location of the server? Am I looking to the location of the transfer? Do I just throw my hands up? Like in the financial transaction space, we a lot of times throw our hands up and go, well, we'll just look to the residence of the recipient because that's the only thing that we kind of know. And this isn't just important for substantive kind of sourcing US versus foreign. It's important for which jurisdictions are going to try to claim jurisdiction over the transaction, as well as, and I say, I know more about VAT and GST and state indirect taxes than I ever knew a couple of years ago, because not only do I care about which jurisdiction will substantively tax like your gain on sale,
right.
I care very much about whose responsibility is it that someone has remitted any indirect taxes that were associated with that transaction. And as a purchaser, it reminds me of, remember when you could buy things on the internet and they didn't charge a sales tax, and then you had to volunteer up the tax at the end of the year when you filled out your tax return, which I did because I am a law-abiding person,
right.
and I would really sit back and be like, what did I buy online, and
right.
what's the sales tax? And it reminds me a little bit of that, because as a purchaser, you're not off the hook if the taxes weren't imposed necessarily, and as a seller, you desperately care.
Right. All right, so what if because you had even mentioned this, what if there's a physical element? Because you know, Rebecca, I'm a big sneakerhead, and a number of companies are out there saying, hey, when you buy the physical product, they'll also give you kind of a digital version of the product. And I understand in other areas they're doing it, it'll be kind of opposite, right? You buy the digital, they'll also send you something physical. How does that kind of change the game?
I mean, it's in some ways really transformative, and at the other time also tremendously confusing. Because if you picture a manufacturing company or a consumer products company that normally they have a whole process about what is manufactured where, sold where, how do you track all your purchases, how do you make sure you're remitting all the right taxes. The sale of the NFT doesn't abide by any of those rules unless you go really out of your way to ring fence that experience. Because since we mentioned geographically anonymous, identity anonymous, if you don't put controls and protections around that purchase transaction, I don't know where you are, so I don't know which of my entities you should be transacting with. I don't know, well, what I do know is I know where your shoes are because I somehow got them physically in your hands. But what I don't know is any information about you that would inform where that purchase actually took place or who I'm transacting with. And a lot of times, if you take the analogy of I bought the shoe and the NFT came with it, that's somewhat manageable,
right?
Because I know where you bought the shoe.
Exactly.
The more common scenario that I spend my time on is I'm giving you, or you're purchasing this NFT, and now you get the thing that comes with it. And you're gonna go claim that in the ordinary course, and you might be able to claim that by presenting your NFT, or you get mailed a coupon, whatever. By the way, how old was that? You'll get mailed a coupon. My mom would be so proud. You might get a code or similar for the redemption. You might be able to order it online. And all of those things will send you back into the normal stream of commerce, but the way you got that NFT is gonna be wholly outside of that. And so one of the really interesting business questions is, if I'm going to do something that's paired, either paired now, or it's anticipated to be paired in the future because you're doing something that looks like a membership card or a loyalty program or something like that, is I have to figure out how to force the physical transaction back into my normal streams of commerce. And I then also have to worry about that NFT. Is that a separate value driver that may have all this independent value associated with it and new things that I need to track? And do I need to build a whole separate mechanism for where I'm going to transact and which customers will be targeted? And because the information can be identity anonymous and geographically anonymous, a lot of the discussion starts with the development team. what information can we get? We know there's certain information like IP address that is absolutely available because there's regulatory and other non-tax reasons that you need to make sure you're not selling into a sanctions jurisdiction, to an OFAC limited address, to someone you shouldn't be transacting in, and is at a leverage point to start knowing the location of your customers.
Yeah, and for our listeners that are waiting for you to tell us this is how these transactions are taxed, I just want to, there are no answers. Right? There are not many answers at this point. And so these are interesting questions that I think policymakers, advisors, taxpayers are all pondering, right? And we know, for example, like, and you were on a prior podcast that I would encourage people to listen to, just really talking about cryptocurrency and the taxation. We know that generally speaking, when cryptocurrency is exchanged for fiat currency, like you get real money, in air quotes, real money, like that's a taxable transaction. That is what we would refer to from the US as a realization event, and everybody knows they're going to pay tax. But when you're within this kind of the metaverse and you're transacting, and we'll talk about services in a bit, but when you're transacting digital purchases, how are these indirect taxes collected? How do you determine what jurisdiction has taxing authorities? Are a lot of open questions.
Absolutely, and unfortunately, or fortunately, you have to answer them today based on the state of the law, where it is in the jurisdictions that are affected by the potential transaction. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention, sometimes when we talk about these concepts and these structures, we also have a world of, if you will, digital tax concepts that have evolved about what do we do with homeless income or income that is easily shifted around. And so we have to take into account all of those principles as well when we're trying to figure out my discrete NFT thing, my cool baseball card or its equivalent, is going to be hosted on a whole technology platform that with itself brings a whole bunch of baggage around where is that value taxed.
All right, so I want to move a little bit more to services, but I'm not really necessarily sure that this is a services. So one of the things, as we've been talking about, are these non-functional tokens, NFTs. Those can be created, right, in the metaverse. And so if somebody is creating NFTs and then they receive compensation, cryptocurrency for that, is that a service that they're providing? Is that a sale of a copyrighted article because we already discussed that it's unique? How do we think about the taxation of sort of those types of NFT creation within the metaverse?
I always think these are the types of things that always lend themselves to a whiteboard, just in the sense of these are multi-party transactions. So imagine I'm the creator, I have a huge YouTube following or similar, I have a platform on which I share knowledge, maybe even give my tax advice.
All right.
And I'm like, I'm gonna tokenize some tax advice. I'm gonna go out there. So I'm the creator in the sense of I am selling the thing, but I'm not even necessarily the one who will be creating the NFT. I'm not that technologically savvy. I'm gonna go to a company who does that sort of thing. I'm gonna pay them
to mint it.
Okay. And so I would ask the question, are they providing me the service of tokenizing that thing that I'm selling?
That feels like a service.
Feels very servicey.
Yeah.
Maybe software as a service, could be,
Yeah.
because it's all technology enabled. Okay, now I have created the NFT and I'm selling it to my adoring public, all three of them.
Right.
And the thing I am selling, you have to really get into the weeds of what are the rights and obligations conveyed in the thing that I sold. So the typical NFT that you will find online is a digital image, or it might be a song, or it might be consumable video content. And those typical things are sold with no additional rights and obligations. You cannot copy it. You cannot put it on a t-shirt. You can't put it on your handbag. You cannot profit from it. And you look at that and you say, okay, I have a piece of intangible property, intellectual property that I can view for personal consumption. I might be able to put it on my homepage of my various social media. I cannot profit off of it. I can just use and enjoy it. That feels a little bit like a copyrighted article.
Yeah.
It definitely doesn't feel like a service.
Right.
However, there are some NFTs that allow you to do stuff, commercialize the thing that you've purchased. That maybe feels a little bit more licensey. If I can do something with it, I can sub-license it, I can rent it or lease it if it's the equivalent of real property. And then if it is extractable from the platform is also another question. We have this discussion around open loop versus closed loop technology. Closed loop technology, you create the NFT, but you can't off-ramp it, you can't take it anywhere, I can't move it to any other digital wallet, I can just trade it within that platform. If I can't divorce the thing I've created from the platform on which it's created, we have a gating question about whether that is software as a service versus a license. So you're gonna say, you didn't give me any answers, which is completely fair, but it it's the reason why when folks are developing their strategy, you actually have to look at what are you intending this thing to do and what rights and obligations are you transferring it, and then we can fit it into a pre-existing tax bucket.
Wow, yeah, just a lot to consider. So let's talk about sort of more traditional services in the metaverse. And so, Rebecca, can we set up our own kind of tax shingle, right, in the metaverse? Presumably we can buy some real estate in the metaverse. We can Lee and McHoney, or McHoney and Lee, I'm not sure which one has the better ring. We can dispense tax advice in the metaverse. What should we be thinking about from a tax perspective? And presumably it may not just be tax advice. I think telemedicine comes to mind, and probably other services. But
personal training.
Personal training.
And by the way, I'm sure risk management people are shuddering right now about we're going to render advice in the metaverse.
Right.
But fundamentally, if we think about services, real services rendered by human beings, not technology enabled services in that sense, normally we look to where the services are rendered. Well,
right.
In the metaverse is not a place. It
right.
is really a technology that is enabling the rendering of services. So perhaps I look to where I'm sitting when I'm rendering the services. So let's say I am, fabulous beachside location outside the United States. You are sitting in Washington, D.C. I am giving my very well licensed tax advice from wherever I'm rendering it. That looks like foreign source income because it looks like the services are being rendered outside the U.S.,
right.
but you're consuming them in the U.S. It gets a little bit more complicated where the technology so enables the service that you also have to ask the question, is it just me giving tax advice, or is there something about the technology that then I really have two services being offered at the same time? My awesome tax advice and whatever the enabling technology is that's allowing me to render it. And do I have something separate that's compensated there that would look to the cloud regs or some other set of sourcing rules to where the services are rendered?
So as an example of that, remote repair, let's say, of machinery. So in other words, you can imagine being within the metaverse, you're operating a business and you have tangible manufacturing assets. And you've got some problems with a particular piece of machinery. So you go into the metaverse and you find the location of the metaverse where that person is, and you're like, hey, I'm having problems with this machinery, can you fix the machinery? And then you can imagine that person being able to come in, and being able to adjust some of the software, effectively remotely being able to adjust that tangible machinery. And how is that supposed to be taxed?
And it's one of my favorite examples because when we take all the fun stuff out of the metaverse and you focus on what real life business problems am I solving?
Yeah, that's a practical.
I can have, if I'm a big company, I can have really complex manufacturing equipment. I can have really complex infrastructure equipment that is difficult to fix with a limited subset of specialists who are able and competent to fix it, who are not necessarily geographically close to where they need to be. And is this a way of really enabling a deeper dive ability to be able to do remote fixes, remote diagnosis, and be able to spread those resources more broadly or render them more efficiently? And I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, do I care about if I'm doing this on top of a wind turbine in the middle of the ocean? Are the services rendered in the middle of the ocean, which is where the wind turbine is that we're remotely working on and where maybe a little robot is in there fixing it? Is it where I'm sitting? Is it where you've called me to ask me to do it? Is it these are really difficult questions. And it also shows that all the enabling technology makes this so much harder to visualize. Because we're not just talking about metaverse. Once my metaverse experience is also interacting with something physical, I'm dealing with robotics, I'm potentially dealing with AI because there might be some automation that goes into and predictive analytics that goes into the what I'm fixing or the where I'm looking. And so I have maybe 8 different value drivers that I'm driving that experience across, in addition to the fact that we're interacting in a decentralized location.
Right. Yeah, so let's talk about kind of what various taxing jurisdictions and authorities kind of have done or are doing to address this. So, Rebecca, I spent a lot of time focused on Pillar 2, right, which is really the extenuation of the OECD's focus on digital taxation. And we've spent a lot of airtime here on the Cross-Border Tax Talks talking about Pillar 2, and I'm pretty certain none of the things in the model rules and the commentary really answer any of the questions that we've been talking about. So Maybe we start with the OECD, and then I'd like to hear what individual jurisdictions may be doing or have done to implement rules and try to give taxpayers or taxing authorities more guidance around this area.
And I think a guiding principle as we have all these discussions is going to be that the lead or the tip of the spear is transparency. So the OECD issued their crypto asset reporting framework, the CARF.
CARF.
Sounds like CARF.
Right, okay.
Plus amendments to the Common Reporting Standard. And that was targeted at, if you will, crypto asset transactions. So think cryptocurrency. And it's targeted at middlemen, platforms, anyone facilitating the exchange of cryptocurrency or crypto assets for other crypto assets or for fiat currency. And if you look at that in the lens of the discussion we just had, they're saying, I don't know what happens at the beginning of the transaction, but I know at the end of the transaction, someone's going to turn that into actual money, or is going to turn that into something that they can use equivalent to money. And the framework, which is over 100 pages and very thoughtful, walks through a very detailed disclosure regime, including for retailers and others that provide goods and services in exchange for cryptocurrency. So it's much broader than just trying to target cryptocurrency exchanges, with the idea of, if we have all the information on the users and we have their transactional information, we will be able to ensure that people are paying tax on the transactions themselves. The OECD is also anticipated to issue a solicitation for feedback around NFTs specifically, with the idea of crypto assets or cryptocurrency is different from NFTs, and we're going to have our own framework around NFT transactions. And that all, I would say largely, it doesn't exactly mirror, but it's similar to provisions in the infrastructure bill from last year that created information reporting on a US Form 1099 for US persons for sales or dispositions or exchanges of cryptocurrency. The scope of those regulations, ambiguous. We were expecting regulations to be issued. They have not been issued yet. I am deathly afraid that by the time this podcast drops, they will have been issued. Okay. Which I don't know if that's good or bad, but it'll be exciting.
We'll bring you back on to dissect those. I look forward to that.
And I think the US government's approach on this, I think similar to other jurisdictions, has been very targeted at the transactions that are both the most timely and the easiest on which to provide published guidance. So the IRS has done a notice, they've done a revenue ruling on very discrete items. They haven't provided something wholesale and sort of more thoughtful about how these transactions ought to be taxed beginning to end.
What about jurisdictions outside the US? I think India and Australia come to mind. I'm sure there's others, so this isn't an inclusive list, but any other jurisdictions worth noting?
I love starting with India, because what India has done here, and India is a huge source of not just creativity and sort of growth in the digital asset space, but it's also for a lot of organizations where their programmers or a portion of their back office or their infrastructure sits. And India imposed basically a really broad set of rules that fundamentally tax any transfer or gift or sale of any kind of digital asset, and it's collected via withholding, and it's a 30% tax. And so it's this massive chilling effect.
Right.
Not so much on the creativity and the everything else, but it causes, if you're an organization who might have been looking at that as a jurisdiction, you really have to think twice about how do you enable yourself to collect and remit taxes when they're due, kind of similar to what people in the US worry about with sales tax. Australia, on the other hand, put out basically a posting on their website about the taxation of NFTs, which, talking to our Australian colleagues, it's great that they're getting in the mix and they're providing something. It's not necessarily holistic in nature, but it's at least showing that they're getting in the game and trying to come up with some rules that make sense. HMRC actually has a comment draft right now, or comments in the UK. Yeah. About a variety of different issues related to decentralized finance. So we've been talking about services up until this point, thinking about fixing my turbine or rendering personal services. Lending as a service and the ability to lend cross-border in a decentralized way is incredibly powerful. And the UK in general, they've issued favorable guidance around so-called trading safe harbor, so trying not to create a trader business that's taxable in the UK by virtue of engaging in digital asset transactions while you might have some nexus with the region. And if you go the other direction entirely, there's a number of jurisdictions that are, if you will, crypto friendly, crypto, or if you will, metaverse curious. And they have very permissive rules, basically waiving the tax on sales and dispositions. And so I think there's a real spectrum, and that is influencing choice of jurisdiction, choice of platform. I think my favorite in all of these areas of guidance has been my interactions with our global firm, because frankly, we get a team of about 130 people together, and because not only are the areas of guidance where jurisdictions have issued specific guidance, like Germany issued something recently, they're different, but also the baseline of, if you will, tax common law underpinning them is different in every jurisdiction. So when you read a release that they've issued where they're either saying something is subject to capital gains tax or it's not, you have to put it in the context of how does the local jurisdiction characterize these transactions. So it's fascinating, but the one thing that when I'm talking to folks about dealing with this, like really tactically when you have to go answer questions, you start with the question of what are the jurisdictions we're actually doing business in. And we've done basically international surveys, go country by country, what's the state of the law? The firm, PwC, publishes an annual crypto report where we do some of that for people across, I think, something like 180 jurisdictions, give or take. And so we try to do the low-hanging fruit of who's issued guidance and what does the guidance say and what's the state of the law. But you have to take it a level deeper when you're trying to then operationalize that. Yeah, very dynamic area. Well, Rebecca, this has been a fascinating conversation, a lot to unpack for taxpayers and advisors. I do look forward to that reg package that we may get here in the US. And this is going to be a very, very dynamic area. And I think the challenge for taxing authorities is that the technology itself is so dynamic that just naturally that continues to change, and the tax laws are, historically just going to be behind right where the technology is. But that will continue to progress, and we'll get more guidance. And when we do, we'll bring you back to the Cross-Border Tax Talks to talk about it. So thanks, Rebecca. So thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks. Thank you, Rebecca Lee, an international tax partner in PwC's Washington National Tax Services Group. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's Global International Tax Services Leader. Stay tuned in 2 weeks for another exciting edition of the Cross-Border Tax Talks podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates and may sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.